Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is the celebrated author Naomi Wolf. She's the author of the renowned early 1990s feminist classic, The Beauty Myth. Her latest book is entitled The End of America, Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot. Welcome.
Thank you.
To anybody that reads this, feels inspired, this book really is a call to action.
It is. I mean, the basic argument of the book is that when would-be despots or would-be dictators want to close down an open society, close down a democracy, or crush a democracy movement, no matter who they are, whether it's Mussolini in the 20s, the National Socialists in the 30s in Germany, East Germany in the 50s, Czechoslovakia in the 60s, right. Pinochet's coup in Chile, the Chinese in the 80s, they all do the same 10 things. They all take the same 10 classic steps to close down a democracy.
It's a playbook.
It's a playbook. It's a blueprint. It's like tick, 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 tick. And what is so shocking to me, and I didn't know this, and I actually wrote the book because a friend of mine who's the daughter of Holocaust survivors kept saying they did this in Germany, they did this in Germany, and I thought she was way out there. I thought this was rhetoric. Right. And I didn't want to think about it, but she forced me to sit down and read history, and not the history of the later years, of course, but the early years when Germany was still a parliamentary democracy with a modern society, celebrities, fashion, architecture, newspapers, an independent judiciary. And in those early years, there was this very comparable systematic assault on the rule of law and the Constitution that opened the door for everything that followed. And seeing this just made my hair stand on end, because we weren't just seeing tactics being reproduced, but actual sound bites and scenes and images being recycled from those 1931, 1932. So when I realized, and read these other histories, I understood that the great dictators were the innovators of this blueprint. Mussolini was the great original mind. Hitler studied Mussolini, Stalin studied Hitler, Hitler studied Stalin, and then petty dictators subsequently reproduced the blueprint. We teach the blueprint at School for the Americas to would-be Latin American dictators. So I can tell you by the clock what time it is from knowing the blueprint, in the sense that, I wrote the book when Thailand was experiencing a coup. And I was like, okay, everyone, there was a coup in Thailand, and they checked through a shopping list of activities, and within a week, a democracy was a police state. And in Burma, Myanmar, 2 weeks ago, because I know the blueprint, it's like, okay, today the monks are marching, tomorrow they're going to fire on the monks, in 3 days they'll suspend communications and, cut off connection to the outside world. Yeah. And so because I'm familiar with the blueprint, and democracy activists around the world are like, no, America, don't do it. Right. Because I'm familiar with the blueprint, I see how dangerous it is that these 10 steps are taking place in America right now. Yeah. That yes, as you said, Mark, the Bush administration seemed systematically to have begun implementing them in the wake of 9/11, and that because we're so historically ignorant and so naive about democracy, in a way the founders would never have wanted us to be naive about democracy, because they knew that an American despot could arise in America to oppress and subjugate Americans. That's why they set up our system this way.
Right, because they had overthrown a monarch themselves.
Well, exactly, and they knew what tyranny was, and they knew, so just to finish that last sentence, then I'll get to the founders. As we're seeing each of these 10 steps in place, people around the world who know how fragile democracy is are like, no, don't make it legal for him to lock up dissidents for 3 years in a Navy brig. No, don't make it easier for him to declare martial law. But we're like, whatever, hypnotized by the scare tactics of 9/11. Yeah. So.
Well, and I was just going to say as well, one of the things that you had pointed out in the book is that a lot of these things are done, if not legally, at least quasi-legally. Yeah. Like you talked about Germany, the Weimar Republic. Yes. The thing is that, a lot of people that normally would oppose things like this allow this kind of despotism to take place.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, people really need to look at Germany, and in The End of America, it comes up very loud and clear. People sort of think that the Nazis came to power in like a conflagration, or it was anarchy. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was a systematic use of the law to pervert the law. Yeah. It was a proliferation of laws, the kinds that we're seeing now. Make it legal to torture, make it legal to criminalize more and more kinds of speech, make it legal to take, I just saw a law saying that they could seize the assets of anti-war protesters, laws expanding the definition of terrorist, which we're seeing now, so that people who look like you and me are now being called terrorist animal rights activists. These are right out of the Nazi playbook. And what people really don't understand was that the National Socialist parliamentarians, who weren't even Nazis, reacted to the Nazis using a terror threat. And the step number 1 in the 10 steps is that all would-be dictators invoke a terrifying internal or external threat, often a real one.
Right.
So there really was arson at the Reichstag, the equivalent of sending a missile into the Pentagon, or sending a plane into the Pentagon, or into Capitol Hill, actually would be the equivalent. And that really happened, and so the National Socialists said, you're unpatriotic unless you sign the Enabling Acts in Clause 2, which makes it legal for us to open German citizens' mail, listen into their phone calls, tap their lines, essentially make it more difficult to march and protest, criminalize more kinds of speech. And Parliament, they weren't Nazis. They were conservatives.
Right.
They were like, okay, we don't want to be unpatriotic, we'll sign away these powers.
Right.
And that opened the door for everything that came later.
It's interesting because it seems like the very definition of what is patriotism is changing. You're talking about Germany. Right now that seems to be very much up for debate. And it seems to be that in this sort of call to action that you have, especially to young people, are you perhaps trying to remind them of what a patriot means, especially in difficult times?
Thank you, Mark. That's exactly right. And that really is, I mentioned my older friend, the daughter of Holocaust survivors, who made me read these histories. Well, it was also for a younger friend that I wrote the book. There is a real young patriot, the young patriot of the subtitle. His name is Chris Ali. His Vietnamese name was Vu, and he's a 28-year-old activist. And I wrote it for him. His own story is relevant. His mom was also 28 when she fled Vietnam with 4-month-old baby Vu in her arms to become a boat person, to risk everything to come to this country. Because she understood liberty the way the founding fathers and mothers of our country did, that it was worth risking her life and her baby's life for him to grow up in freedom. And it's so ironic that it's that freedom that is being undermined right now. And I wrote this in a very clear, accessible way, especially for young people, or really anyone. Most of us aren't constitutional scholars. I'm not a lawyer. I couldn't understand the Bill of Rights and the Constitution without someone sitting me down and explaining it to me in ordinary language. And so I wrote it very accessibly because I felt Chris and his peers, and really all of us right now, needed both a primer or a reminder, an easy guide to how societies close down, how easy it is to crush a democracy, so we can recognize from the evil days of the 20th century, what the warning signs are, but also a reminder of what democracy is, for young people who may not have been taught very much about the founders' vision, and definitely to reclaim patriot. You're quite right that post 9/11, there's been this branding of patriot as someone who stands up for American decisions, right or wrong, no matter how morally reprehensible. You're torturing people, fine, whatever. You're tapping phone lines, fine, whatever.
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. And that it would have horrified the founders. The founders, you're quite right. Why did we have the Second Amendment? The founders knew what it was like to live in a country where you were colonized by an aggressive army that was not answerable to the people, King George's men and mercenaries. They would break into the colonists' homes, go through their stuff, take their stuff, rape and molest women. And they saw how easy it is for a population, no matter how courageous, to be subjugated by a standing army. So the Second Amendment says you can't have a standing army that's not answerable to the people. And that's why the governors are responsible for the National Guard, and that's why we don't have mercenaries terrorizing us. Well, what's step number 3? I skipped ahead. Step number 1 was invoke a terrifying internal external threat. Number 2 is create a prison system outside the rule of law where torture takes place. And like create military tribunals, where prisoners are stripped of due process. And the reason that's so scary is, to us, is that every would-be despot starts by torturing people on the margins, whatever, brown people, Muslims, whatever, gypsies, Jews, homosexuals, whatever. But then there's a blurring of the line. You can't name a society where this didn't happen. And even this, and then they come for you and me, basically. Well, and even like you had said, again, with the internal and external threat, the idea of enemy combatants. Thank you.
It's this idea, again, that, foreigners can be declared terrorists, enemy combatants, but one of the key points of the book seems to be that U.S. citizens have been currently, and that's increasing all the time, have been declared enemy combatants. And you had also said that the president, on his own say-so now, can just arbitrarily declare you that.
This is why I have nightmares. I mean, I'm literally like dreaming about this stuff because it is so dangerous. You are quite right. That is a key point of my book. And it's like, I mean, I want to say, you know, Wake Up America is exactly it. Yo, this is so bad because here's why. When I walk out of here, or when you walk out of here, or it really doesn't matter, when the guy who is sweeping the street, you know, gets to the end of the next block, no matter how innocent we are, no matter that we haven't done anything, on his say-so alone, the president can say, Mark, you're an enemy combatant. Naomi, you're an enemy combatant. Person sweeping the street, you're an enemy combatant. Head of the Republican National Committee, you're an enemy combatant. It's like Mother May I. He says it, that's it.
Yeah.
And you and I will find ourselves in a 10 by 12 foot cell in a Navy brig, in solitary confinement, waiting for up to 3 years to see our family, see our lawyers, have charges filed.
Yeah.
So they can't torture us yet. However, this is bad because psychiatrists know that prolonged isolation makes sane people like you and me mentally ill.
Right.
And so, you know, in a closing society, people don't understand. It doesn't take a coup. A closing democracy looks like a series of tipping points. It's not even like a linear sort of diagonal. It's what Malcolm Gladwell would call tipping points.
Right,
and
exactly.
So I'm still talking, but my personal limit is when I open the newspaper and read that someone I identify with, a journalist, a writer, an editor, has been named an enemy combatant and is in a Navy brig.
Wow.
That's when I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the time to rise up is now because history shows that it takes a handful of such arrests, such abuses, for people to just go quiet. And even while civil society institutions are still intact.
Now, also, it's interesting because you mentioned that you personally have been put on some kind of a list. I think you mentioned that maybe at about 9 out of 10 airports domestically, they're searching you more extensively, and that you had asked them, you know, what's going on, and finally some security guard had said, well, you're on the list.
Yeah.
And you're like, what list?
Yeah, actually, I'm no longer being put on the quadruple S no watch list. I'm sorry. There are 2 lists.
Okay.
One is the watch list, and it means that you are identified as a high security threat. Quadruple S's, that's what I was getting for a year and a half.
Really?
Every time I flew. I mean, my friends were like, I'll meet you at the gate, because it was just every time I flew. And I don't fit any terrorist profile that, you know.
And is that specifically a terrorist profile?
Well, the idea is that you need to be subjected to extra scrutiny because you pose a security threat.
You're subversive in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So this at first is just annoying. In a strong democracy, it's just annoying because they can't do anything to you, you know, except search you. But I finally, you know, kept asking why, and finally someone from the TSA said, you're on the list. And I'm like, the list?
Yeah.
What list? And then I reported it out, and sure enough, many, many critics of the administration are on the list, and the numbers are growing all the time. And it's getting really scary. I mean, this is step number 4, arbitrarily detain and release citizens, actually step number 5.
Yeah.
And so staffers at the ACLU are on the list. Richard Murphy, top constitutional scholar at Princeton, who had just given a speech critical of Bush's assault on the Constitution, was put on the list. Ted Kennedy is on the list.
Wow.
Little old lady activists in San Francisco who are anti-war activists are on the list. I get these emails that just scare me every day. Jessica Rakoff was at the Justice Department, a lawyer. She told her colleagues, don't torture John Walker Lind, the American Taliban. Make sure he has a lawyer present when you talk to him. She found that her emails disappeared. There was an investigation of her. She was referred to the Bar Association, and now she's on the list. And a high-ranking military guy who served his country bravely in combat missions was critical of the war. Not only is he on the list, but his 15-year-old son is on the list, and his 83-year-old mother is on the list.
Wow.
So I am very worried about this because for the following reason. Every time I speak, someone comes up to me and says something like, I wrote, weeping. People are crying. I mean, I wrote this essay on Fire Dog Lake called American Tears because I thought when I wrote this book that I'd be like projecting a dark reality that was down the road that we could avert. But what is so disturbing to me is that now that I've crossed the country speaking about this to people from all walks of life, the stories coming in make it clear that the reality is now.
Yeah.
And it's late. because, you know, someone came up to me in Seattle and said, I wrote a letter to the editor that was critical of Bush, and my 10-year-old son is on the list, and I can't, and then she started crying, I can't get him off, I can't, you know, is this going to follow him for the rest of his life? Now, it's even more disturbing, if you want me to play this out.
Sure.
In a little while, the airlines' oversight of the list is going to be yielded to the Transportation Security Administration.
Really?
And these lists are secret. And after there was some play about the TSA list on the internet from an essay I wrote, the New York Times asked the White House about the list and about all the critics who are on the list. And they're like, and I knew that there were combined 125,000 people on the two lists.
Okay.
And they said, well, there are 800,000 people on the lists. Of course, there are going to be errors and repetitions of names. So that's 1 in 300 people. Now, where it gets really scary, in a fascist shift, and I use that term very conservatively and technically, it's not rhetoric.
Okay.
It's when the state starts to use terror against the individual to oppose democracy, according to one dictionary definition. The state will start to make it hard for critics to cross borders and make it intimidating for people when they're trying to cross borders. It's a way of pressuring critics and dissidents. So what's getting very disturbing is reports from around the country that when people are waiting in security lines in the United States, all over the country, suddenly TSA agents will yell, freeze, to these people waiting in line. Nothing's happening.
Okay.
And they have to freeze for up to half an hour, which again is a Nazi tactic to make prisoners freeze. If they moved, bad things would happen. And then to add to that, this Mills College professor was taken off the plane in San Francisco, taken to an interrogation room. Americans don't know that U.S. airports now have interrogation rooms. And she was told not to move, and that if she moved, they would consider it that she was assaulting her interrogator.
Wow.
Now, Maher Arar, a yuppie software engineer from Canada, was on a totally neutral flight. He was taken off the plane, I think at JFK or Newark, to one of these interrogation cells, kept there for 48 hours, not allowed to call his lawyer, and shipped off to Syria to be tortured for months. They had the wrong guy. And
it's still being denied, from what I understand.
It's still being denied, right? The Canadian government is like, we're so sorry, and people have been fired and had to resign. And the U.S. is like, whatever, he's still on the list. We're not telling you why. So the point is, I'm nervous every time now I go through security. When I got to Vermont, and then I'll stop. I mean, this is just like the most kind of scary and egregious ratcheting up. So I think I need to share it in detail. When I got to Vermont to copy edit my book, I opened my suitcase where my computer was in my hotel room, and inside my suitcase was a letter from the Transportation Security Administration telling me they'd gone through their stuff.
Really?
So maybe this is routine, you know, but
I've never heard of that.
I'd never heard of it either,
you
know, and it certainly means that I've started to go through what I'm carrying and ditch stuff before I get on a plane. And it's not unreasonable, because at any moment I could be shifted, or any of us could be shifted from the watch list to the no-fly list. They don't have to tell you why, and really it's almost impossible to get off the list once you're on.
It's interesting because, you know, with the idea of the war on terror being an ongoing war, I'm wondering too, like you had said, you had actually used the word cakewalk to talk about the McCarthyism of the 50s compared to now. And like you said, you don't want to use a word like fascism lightly, but you definitely do feel that what's happening right now is actually worse, because that's a dark period in American history. Oh,
you know, may that be the worst of our problems, as my grandmother would say. This will, if we keep going down this road, that will look like the good old days.
Wow.
Here's why. Very specific reason. Again, I don't use the term fascism lightly, but the state has started to use the threat of force against individuals to oppose democracy. And that's a tipping point that America has never faced in its entire history. You know, I skipped over, I think, step number 2, which is create a paramilitary force, where we were talking about that, not answerable to the people.
Like Blackwater?
Well, exactly. So right now, Blackwater is murdering civilians in cold blood they did 3 weeks ago in Iraq. And they operate outside the rule of law in Iraq because Paul Bremer made sure that would happen. Now, what's very disturbing is reading that the State Department is covering up for Blackwater during the investigation, both from Iraqi authorities and from the FBI. So when the state starts to create a thug caste of murderers and torturers, and I'm not overstating anything. You know, Eric Prince, the CEO of Blackwater, likes to wrap these guys in the flag. But in fact, he systematically recruits paramilitary military from countries that torture and terrorize their own civil society leaders. Nigerians, Ecuadorians, Salvadorans, Chileans, right,
wow.
from Pinochet's guys.
Sure. Yeah.
They're the ones, so that's happening in Iraq. So Blackwater is already operating in the United States. They were invited by Homeland Security to patrol the streets of New Orleans in the wake of Katrina,
right.
and Jeremy Scahill has at least one report of contractors firing on civilians in New Orleans. Tomorrow, according to the situation that exists right now, Blackwater could be tasering demonstrators in Times Square or gunning people down. If the state has started to, in America, you know, because of a provocation to public order, if the state starts to protect a paramilitary group that is engaged in violence, there is no way democracy can stand up to that, history shows. I mean, this is, in Italy, it was a parliamentary democracy, and the black shirts were deployed to beat up civilians systematically. And Mussolini was like, I didn't send them, you know, but this sort of softened up the population. And this worked so well that Hitler reproduced the tactic with the brown shirts, even before they were majority in power. And once enough people get beaten up, which is why I'm really wanting to know more about what happened to Randy Rhoads.
Right.
Because according to the blueprint, what starts to happen now is individual critics get hurt, or citizens start getting hurt.
And
like
they
this
self-censor.
And they self-censor. And if, you know, I'm relieved to hear that her spokespeople said it wasn't a hate crime. But I also know that if, God forbid, I were targeted for some sort of violence by, you know, this thug cast that they're developing, I would be so freaked out that I would say, you know, it's not a hate crime. I'm not saying that's what's happened here. I'm saying that historically this is what happens, is that people get hurt and then they just close down. And understandably, you know, are just too afraid to confront the state anymore. I don't mean to talk about this one case. I'm just saying historically that's what happens.
Right.
So to go back to your question about why are the 50s nothing compared to this, you're quite right about the difference in the war on terror opposed to any other time. I mean, there have been times of repression before where we've been at war. World War I, the Espionage Act, they rounded up thousands of people like us, beat us, kept us in prison. But then the pendulum swung the other way. They interned the Japanese Americans during World War II. The pendulum swung the other way when the war was over. But this war, Bruce Fein points out, of the American Freedom Agenda, has been defined as global in scope and eternal in space. So there is no point at which the war will be over. And we can go back to civil liberties. Now, why are the 50s so much less dangerous? If I had been put on a blacklist in the 50s, I would be facing the loss of my career, and I'd have to do other work. I wouldn't get to be a screenwriter anymore. Okay, so that's no fun, that's bad. But I wouldn't be facing mental illness in solitary confinement for 3 years. And I wouldn't be facing whatever god-awful ratcheting up of violence against civilians legally, tasering of civilians, you know, preventive detention. Mukasey says he's in favor of preventive detention. Mukasey, the guy that they're probably going to be confirming for U.S. Attorney General, is the guy who wrote the law, or the edict that says that the president can declare you or me an enemy combatant. So people could be brave and stand up during the blacklist years, because it's not that big a deal to lose your job. It's not good. It shouldn't happen in democracy. But torture changes everything. I mean, people who are very courageous, if they're not going to be tortured, close down if they're going to be tortured. I'm the same way, especially if you've got children. Am I going to bring my kids to, you know, the next anti-war march if they're tasering people? You know?
Just the threat of that is enough to make you scared. Well, it's interesting, too, because you talk about the pendulum. You know, normally in American history that would swing back, and you're saying that essentially this is not a partisan issue. I mean, for instance, there's a lot of people that say, let's say the government changes to the Democrats in 2008, 2009. You're saying this is not something that's going to take care of itself. This is a whole new thing, because executive power, once gotten, is very hard to pull back regardless of the administration.
You are so right. I mean, first, I cannot stress enough that this is not a partisan issue. I mean, I wrote the book. I hope it comes clear, very open-handedly inviting conservatives, Republicans, evangelicals, military men and women, as well as progressives and independents, to join together to stand up for the Constitution.
Yeah.
The Constitution is not a partisan document.
Right.
And the founders totally knew, as you said, that this abuse of power, once power is unchecked, they understood, and we've forgotten, it's an 18th century understanding that human nature is corruptible, and that if you don't restrain or check people's power, they will abuse it eventually.
Even good people.
Even good people,
right.
And history shows that it takes about 20 minutes for good people with unchecked power to become abusive, and whichever party's in power. I mean, they wrote, the Bill of Rights in fear. I didn't realize that, and their fear was of exactly what we're seeing now. They feared an unchecked executive, but they also feared an unchecked Congress or an unchecked majority, because they knew that if you didn't have this beautiful system of checks and balances, it was the default to lock people up, intimidate them, oppress them.
Right.
Democracy is hard, and if you can just jail and intimidate the opposition, who's going to stand up to the temptation? So I just was meeting with Michael Ratner this morning, who's the head of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and he represents the detainees. And he made the case that historically, every time, the presidents just don't give up power. And as bad as this is, I mean, again, I keep thinking of the Germans, as bad as it was in 1931, it just got worse in 1933. As bad as it is to see the systemic dismantling of these rights, whether it's Giuliani or Hillary or Obama inheriting these powers, you no longer have democracy. And people really don't understand how scary that is. It's not going to make me feel better if Hillary can put, Drudge in prison or, Bill O'Reilly in prison. This is not America.
Right.
And so it's completely a transpartisan issue. And I'm glad to say, although I'm also sorry to say, that on the road, I would say my audiences were as much Republican as Democrat.
Oh, interesting.
Yes,
okay.
And there are as many conservatives who are freaked out about this.
Well, that's interesting, because I was going to say, in terms of feedback, even though you're saying it's not a partisan issue, I would imagine people on the left would maybe be more open to this, but you're saying that it's not. I'm just wondering, what kind of criticism, what kind of feedback have you had? Has there been anything that has maybe, taught you something you didn't know? Was there anything that surprised you, perhaps?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I certainly haven't. I was expecting the right to smear me, and they haven't. I mean, by and large.
That's surprising.
It is and it isn't.
Yeah.
If it's a powerful argument, a good media tactic is to ignore it and hope it goes away.
Interesting.
I mean, I would welcome more, negative attention from the right, in order to get the word out more effectively.
Sure.
There has been basically a mainstream media blackout. I don't think these things are an intentional conspiracy. I mean, all of my loved ones are the mainstream media, and they don't sit around saying, let's not cover this or that. But I think it's notable that all the mainstream press outlets and TV outlets I usually do really aren't touching this.
They're not going near it?
No, by and large not. And so in terms of feedback, I mean, unfortunately, I was hoping, that critics would say this is extreme, this is off the charts, there are no parallels. But overwhelmingly, unfortunately, what I'm hearing and experiencing is people from all walks of life saying, okay, I knew in my gut something was wrong. This shows me the big picture. This shows me what these 10 steps are. Thank you for, it's better to know.
Yeah.
As awful as it is, it's better to know.
Sure.
And how do we take action now? And what they're saying is, unfortunately, is it too late?
You're talking about people taking media into their own hands, people protesting, just people standing up for themselves. What would be your advice to somebody that reads this book or sees this interview and says, what can I do?
What can I do, exactly. Yeah. That's the best question to ask right now for all of us. And I just want to finish a thought about Blackwater, because I don't think I spelled out why there's such urgency.
Sure.
Blackwater's business model is to expand its deployment domestically, and they just got a $1 billion contract from Homeland Security to do that. So what that means is they're going to be expanding their presence here at home in the event of a natural disaster or a public emergency. And then just to close the circle, step 10 is to subvert the rule of law and make it easier to declare martial law. And the months leading up to an election historically are the most unstable in a closing democracy, the most likely to see provocations people dressed like demonstrators, for instance, or voter registration groups who then engage in violence,
right,
leading
inciting
to an excuse. Yeah, and we've seen this in America before with COINTELPRO, but leading to a justification for a crackdown, declaration that there's need to restore public order. And to close the circle, the president, as of the 2007 Defense Authorization Act, now has the power on his say-so alone to declare a public emergency.
Yeah.
So tomorrow, voter registration groups could be signing people up in a swing state, and Blackwater will be deployed to, or the National Guard, a federalized National Guard, can now be deployed to basically create martial law in that state over the objections of the governor of the state that the federalized National Guard was sent from, and the governor of that state where, we're under lockdown. This could happen in New York tomorrow.
And you think of all the signing statements that a president can use. Even if Congress were to write something to say you can't do that, he can just opt out, essentially.
Yeah, unfortunately. And I mean, and then I'll get to what we can do,
Yeah.
Like right now, the president is just basically ignoring Congress and just ignoring them. And I think it's fascinating how Congress is reacting. I think there's some gender politics here. I don't think women would have trouble saying, he's just beating the shit out of us and abusing us and ignoring us, and we don't exist.
Yeah.
But I think it's so, and I'm sorry to have used an obscenity, I hope you can black it out.
No, go ahead.
Whatever, beep it out. Let me re-say that. I think women might have less problem saying we are being completely victimized and abused and ignored. Right now, we're no longer in the discourse of democracy. There's something else going on.
Right.
But it must be so demeaning for the men of Congress to recognize that they have no power anymore. That it's a psychological thing of making it seem like it's okay. So, okay, don't give us the documents about Mukasey. Okay, we won't ask for them. Just let us pretend to say something about the Mukasey nomination so it won't be so humiliating that you're like totally ignoring us and we're Congress.
Yeah, they're being emasculated.
Well, they've been emasculated.
Okay,
I mean, what I want to describe is that at the end point, the last stage of closing society, when it's been a democracy, people are in this hangover state where they can't believe it's really happening. And they keep it's like a phantom limb, they keep doing democracy.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, it's like the Marshall deployment is just moving along. There's this scene in the 20s, in 1920, I believe, when Mussolini's black shirts had already marched on Rome. It was already over. But Parliament was still meeting and trying to negotiate with him, and they kept offered him 4 cabinet positions. And he's just like waiting for them to realize that it isn't democracy anymore.
Wow.
That time for negotiating is over.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're in this hangover period
like
where
an appeasement phase almost.
Congress is behind the American people because the American people get it that it's not democracy anymore.
Yeah.
They're not engaged in democracy anymore. It's another game.
Yeah.
So it's a crisis. And Congress is like, we're still going to pretend that you're listening to us and that we have any power in this system at all. What do we do?
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty serious. Okay, 3 things. You go to AmericanFreedomCampaign.org, which is a new group that I co-founded with Wes Boyd, the head of Move On, and Bill Hazeltine, the guy who sequenced the human genome, and a few other people. And we've got many partner organizations and almost 5 million members in those partner organizations.
Okay.
So it's a beginning. We need 50 million.
Yeah.
But there is a pledge that you can sign, and we're making all the candidates sign it. All the Democrats have now signed it. Now we're going to the Republicans to restore the Constitution and the rule of law. It's not enough. There's a 10-point legislative agenda that if Congress passed it, it would stabilize democracy.
Okay.
Things like restore habeas corpus, protect journalists from prosecution, push back the Military Commissions Act. Good news is Ron Paul, who is on the right, but whatever, introduced this legislation because we have a parallel organization on the right, the American Freedom Agenda.
Okay.
And the legislation is almost identical.
Right.
He introduced it to Congress yesterday. So you guys all email, call your representatives and make them pass this legislative agenda.
Yeah.
But the third thing, I'm going to say it, there is no time. There really isn't time because at the end of America, there are these series of what-ifs, according to the historical record, things that are very unpleasant that could easily play out before the election, which basically will mean that the election will be meaningless and that we've basically shifted into a system that's no longer a democracy.
And you've said, like, essentially we've subcontracted so many things to pundits, to professionals, to constitutional experts. So again, what can just a regular citizen...
Thank you. So just to get to that,
Yeah.
a regular citizen can drive, this is what we have to do, hearings, congressional hearings, to investigate the crimes of this administration with an eye to impeaching and prosecuting these criminals. And it'll take a mass movement. I said to Michael Ratner, who gave me a tutorial in the 3 major crimes that are prosecutable, that they've committed. And this is not rhetoric, that they've committed against the founders' vision, against the Constitution, impeachable and prosecutable crimes.
Okay.
And what it would do to, and I said, well, what do you need for us to do that? He said, we need a mass movement calling for hearings so that Congress, they're afraid of budging right now because they're afraid of looking soft on terror.
Right.
If 5 million people or 50 million people call them because they understand that a police state is much scarier than this hyped terror threat in a stable democracy, then we can drive the hearings, which position this as a crime, and we can impeach and prosecute these criminals. And this saves the whole system because it's a way of showing that there is accountability for committing crimes against the Constitution.
Now, I've got to ask you, how hopeful are you about this movement? Are you very optimistic? Are you kind of hedging your bets? Where are you right now?
Basically, I don't even hedging my bets. Like, someone said, well, one of the things on the agenda is a national strike. And the first one has been talked about for November 6th, and we've just started hiring an organizer, again, to strike every month, to sit down for the Constitution across the country to start a national movement. I don't, and someone's like, well, what if no one shows up? And someone else is like, what if you ruin your professional reputation by, calling for this and people don't show up? And we are so in a time where those questions don't matter anymore. We have no choice. We have no choice. It's not business as usual anymore. So am I hopeful that millions of Americans will wake up in time? It's completely up to those Americans. I mean, this is one of those, it's in your court. You were right. People are feeling powerless. People I talk to, they're in despair, but they feel powerless. They're like, I wrote to Congress. They don't care. Their analysis is that nothing they do matters. But the only thing that will save us is if millions of Americans rise up and say enough and drive these hearings and these prosecutions and restore these laws. So I did say in the book that people feel powerless because that job of defending democracy kind of did get subcontracted out to politicians, constitutional scholars. We'll worry about the Constitution. And so ordinary people feel like there's no role for them. But we've got to switch it around. And the good news is, if you look at history, when millions of people stand up and say enough, there is no power on earth that can hold them back if there is a vestige of civil society left. The good news is, bullies are cowards, and when the people turn on them, they fold. So I'm going to throw that back out to you. If we don't rise up right now, things look very, very dark for all of us. Every single one of us. No, I don't care if you're a Republican or not. In a real police state, there is no safety. But if we do rise up, we can not only restore democracy and the rule of law, we can really kind of usher in a golden age where ordinary American citizens remember that they're the ones in charge, and they're the ones who have the patriots' task of defending and protecting democracy.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.